First thing I'd like to do is unpack the term top tier regulator, or as you might hear us say, top quartile regulator. I'm wondering, Colette, if we can start with you, if you can tell us what that term means to you. How would you define it?
Thank you, Christine. And let me say before I begin how wonderful it is to be virtually with all of our campus friends. I miss you guys in person, and thank you in particular for your leadership. We have strongly enjoyed our partnership and collaboration with the Canadian regulator and all of the individuals who give so much to CAMPUT. So thank you so much for the invitation to you and to CEO Zagar. When I think about what it means to be a top quartile regulator, I envision individuals who are committed to working and never stopping in doing their best work to serve the sector. I also think about a regulator that is independent. So I really enjoyed seeing the polling questions that you put forward. It's critical that a top quartile regulator operate in an independent way. The regulator has to make a number of very difficult decisions, high stakes decisions, and has to do so in a way that is free from influence from outside sources of any type, political, the business sector, and otherwise. And also a regulator that is very open and really paying honor to transparency and due process. These are some of the critical elements that I think instill and sustain confidence in the work of the regulator, builds trust and relationships, not inappropriate relationships, but strong working relationships that really are at the foundation of this work. I could go on with a number of other adjectives and attributes of the top quartile regulator, but why don't I pause to give time for our colleagues to join in?
Okay, well, I'm going to turn to Ben because I saw him nodding there as you were speaking. So it looks to me like maybe he's in agreement with some of what you said. Ben, can I turn it over to you?
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And likewise, great to be here. Really enjoy the opportunity to talk to everybody today. I think there's a lot of agreement with Colette. I'll actually start with how you measure it. How do you measure a top quartile regulator? And my view would be, it would be the same way you measure a top quartile regulated business, which is what are the outcomes we're getting for the public and for the customers. And let's start with the energy trilemma, right? So affordability, sustainability, reliability, and we can add in things like safety and customer service as well. I think if you've got top quartile outcomes in those areas for customers, then most likely you've got a top quartile regulator contributing to delivering that. So I think that's a great way to measure it. And of course, what that does is it drives alignment. And often there's too much focus, I think, on a zero-sum game, a win-lose dynamic between regulator and regulated companies. But actually, if you step back and look at it, we all want the same thing, which is those top quartile outcomes for customers. So I think that's how, at the highest level, one should measure it. What are some of the characteristics, behavioral characteristics of a top quartile regulator that helps to deliver it? I think, Colette mentioned a lot of those. I absolutely echo the behavioral type ones. Stability, predictability, transparency, accessibility, those things are really important, and they just go a long way to be able to operate in an efficient manner. And I'm sure we'll talk more about efficiency as well. And of course, Susanna mentioned that in her opening remarks. I do think there's something about promoting win-win areas where actually we can collaborate naturally, driving down risk in the sector that benefits everybody. And I think focusing businesses on outcomes for customers is another area where we can win-win.
Thank you, Ben. David, can I turn to you and ask what your definition of a top quartile regulator would be? Oh, I think you're on mute there, David. That's great.
I have very little to add to what Colette and Ben have described as their characteristics of a top quartile regulator. I guess one of the things that strikes me as interesting in the proposition of becoming a top quartile regulator is how do you actually measure it? And we've come up with a whole lot of things that we would value in the top quartile regulator, but how do we measure whether or not the OEB has actually achieved that particular status at any point in time? And so I think part of if the ambition is in measurable terms to become a top quartile regulator, it's absolutely critical that the OEB spend some time devising methodologies by which that particular question is going to be answered. Are we indeed a top quartile regulator? And I think in answering that question, we've got to, and some of this was implicit in, or explicit, I should say, in what Colette was saying, in whose mind are we talking about when we're talking about a top quartile regulator? Who are the interested parties? Who are the stakeholders? How do we measure their reaction to the way in which the OEB has been functioning? And as one of my colleagues said recently, in relation to energy regulators, the most important or critical thing is, in a lot of ways, that they achieve respect across the range of stakeholders with whom they interact regularly, across the public's mind, and indeed respect in the minds of the government of the day. And so I think respect is important, vital, in fact, in any ambitions to become a top quartile regulator. The only other point that I would make from, I guess, a more legal perspective is a top quartile regulator is indeed one that attempts to balance the requirements of efficiency against the legal requirements of procedural fairness or natural justice, as it's sometimes called. And so from my perspective as a legally trained person, that's one of the challenges I think that lies ahead for the OEB.